Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. Of course, without a doubt. And the reasoning behind that is pretty simple. The reasoning being the field of international relations as we study it has long ignored European errors and passed over thoughts outside of the typical European canon. So, before we begin to get into the specifics of that, before we begin to delve into how international relations is indicative of Eurocentricity at its core, it's first necessary to clarify the exact definition of Eurocentricity. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, Eurocentricity is the action of, quote, focusing on European culture or history to the exclusion of a wider view of the world, implicitly regarding European culture as preeminent, end quote. So as I'm going to elaborate on, the action of our international relations surveys ignoring European errors and regarding European culture as absolutely preeminent, as well as excluding views of other parts of the world, our study of international relations is at core undisputably Eurocentric. So let's first delve into the first reason for Eurocentricity, the field of international relations grossly ignoring European colonialism. W. E. Du Bois writes, quote, education was so arranged that the young learn not necessarily the truth, but that aspect and interpretation of the truth which the rulers of the world wish them to know and follow. So of course Du Bois was referring to the implicit decision of European schools to entirely disregard the collapse of European society in the early 20th century. I think, however, that his quote is also particularly telling in regard to the Eurocentricity intrinsic to international relations. The course of the past several decades have observed a number of surveys, histories, and debates regarding international relations. In most of them, have argued that international relations as a formal, thematic theme of study was established in the wake of World War I, often denoting the point of conception at the establishment of the first chair in international politics at the University of Wales in 1919. The definition that has widely been accepted by the international community, however, entirely disregards a practice that was especially prevalent in international relations: colonialism, often racist colonialism. Says Edward Said, reflecting this point, quote, there is a virtual unanimity that the subject races should be ruled, that they are subject races, that one race deserves and has consistently earned the right to be considered the race whose main mission is to expand beyond its own demand. So I think that defining international relations as post-World War I entirely disregards the prevalent racist, imperialistic colonialism that defined the preceding centuries. Moreover, it's also important to note that many scholars define the wake, the beginning of the idea of international relations, what enabled the study of international relations to take root as the Peace of Westphalia. Says in International Relations textbook, quote, our present international society is directly descended from the universalized European system, end quote. Says another textbook, quote, the expansion of international society has entailed the spread of European forms of states, democracy, law, and rights to non-European areas and people. Both writers were no doubt referring to colonialism, but they don't refer to it by name. Simply referring to imperialism as, quote, the expansion of international society is equivalent to equating slaves as simply workers. The conscious choice of international relations textbooks and international relations surveys to drastically ignore this rampant colonialism and imperialism reflects this implicit Eurocentricity intrinsic to our study of international relations. By deliberately ignoring colonialism that was often characterized by theft, racism, massacre, genocide, and much more, we are conforming to a Eurocentric and ignorant view of our history. Moreover, so regarding the second point, the Eurocentricity of international relations is further conformed by the lack of thought in scholars outside of the European canon. The canon of international relations is restricted to a handful of scholars. Scholars like Machiavelli, scholars like Hobbes, scholars like Kant, Hegel, etc. So there's something pretty odd about all these writers. They all are male European thinkers from time zones spanning ancient Greeks to the Enlightenment, all from Europe. So there's no brevity or lack of international scholars in other parts of the world. In fact, there were a lot of international scholars who were pretty great. Scholars like Sri Aurobindo, Anthony Angie, Jomstorm Gotti, B.S. Chimney, to name a few, who made points equivalent to or superior to European scholars, but were nonetheless excluded from IR surveys and novels. Why? Because they weren't Western, they weren't from the Eurocentric center of the world that has come to define international relations. Moreover, when we study international relations, we look at European states, not non-Western ones. We talk about the balance of power, we look at the Athenians and the Spartans. We look at models for democracy, we consider Britain or the Western states. We entirely gloss over examples of democracies in other parts of the world. Reflecting this point, according to a study conducted by Allison Ayers, democracy in non-Western parts of the world existed and was actually quite successful. Ayers writes, quote, "The detailed analysis of different forms of African models of production of democracy in itself affirms the legitimacy of Africa's history and Africa's own experience of democracy." In addition, while the Haitian Revolution was indeed an indicator of democracy, we exclude it from a study of international relations. Why? All going back to this idea of implicit Eurocentricity that we define the very basis, the very core of our international relations in terms of one group of people, in terms of one place, and entirely gloss over every single thing else. So yeah, in regard to your question, to say the least, international relations is Eurocentric. So first and foremost, I think that's a really great question. I think the answer is that it's going to take some time. It's not impossible though. So when we're faced with questions like this, we have to look at past examples, past precedents. Anthropology faced a similar problem. It was born and raised in colonialism. But over the course of the past decade, we have seen vast efforts to rethink the discipline and shed its colonial roots. And it's worked. So thus the question, how should we study international relations instead of our Eurocentric ignorant model? Well, first and foremost, we can't start studying IR at the Treaty of Westphalia in the wake of World War I. Rather, our study of IR has to start much earlier. Has to start with the first instances of colonialism, of imperialism. Has to date all the way back to 1415, when the Portuguese conquered Seda. And it can't just gloss over these examples. Rather, it has to explore them. It has to drive far down deep into the motivations for these conquests. It has to explore beliefs, like Kipling's beliefs in the white man's burden. And IR just can't use westward states as examples of successful democracy. Why? Because that connotes that westward states were the only ones that achieved this pinnacle of success. Rather, we have to study democracy in post-apartheid South Africa. We have to study the burgeoning democracy from the Haitian Revolution. And of course, most significantly, we shouldn't just study Kant, Machiavelli, Hobbes, etc., etc. We shouldn't just study European Eurocentric males. Instead, we should study scholars who made equal contributions. Scholars like Sri Aurobindo. The plan's not perfect. I get that. There's no questioning that, but it's a step in the right direction. A step away from Eurocentrism that only distorts our history. W.E. Du Bois stated, quote, "Certain suppressions in the historical record in our day will lead to a tragic failure in assessing causes. Our current surveys of IR are bound with these suppressions that seek to promote Eurocentricity, so much so that they don't actually reflect our history." W.E. Du Bois was right when he warned of the pitfalls of not studying our historical record fully. As such, I'm here to tell you that we have to change our current thinking of international relations. We have to change it so it's not Eurocentric. We have to change it so it's not ignorant, and most of all, we have to change it so it's not wrong.